October 732. The air was cold enough that morning for men to see their breath as they stood waiting in the fields between Tours and Poitiers. Mist drifted low across the countryside. Horses shifted restlessly in the distance. Spears rested against shields. Somewhere beyond the trees, thousands of men watched one another in silence. For days, neither army had moved. One commander hoped patience would become a weapon. The other knew that every hour spent waiting made his position more difficult. What happened here would later become one of the most debated battles in European history. Medieval writers would describe it as the moment Europe was saved. Modern historians would challenge many of those claims. Yet even after centuries of argument, one fact remains difficult to dismiss. The Battle of Tours halted a major Umayyad advance into Gaul, strengthened Charles Martel, and helped shape the political future of Western Europe. The men standing on that field could not have known any of that. They knew only that a powerful army had crossed the Pyrenees, crushed its opponents, and advanced deep into Frankish territory, and now it stood directly in front of them. To understand why, we need to begin with a frontier that had been moving north for more than 20 years. In 711, Muslim armies crossed from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula. Within a remarkably short period of time, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed. Cities surrendered. Armies were defeated. New governors arrived. A region that had once been ruled by Visigothic kings became part of Al-Andalus, connected to the vast Umayyad world stretching across North Africa and the Middle East. The speed of that expansion shocked contemporaries. Only a century earlier, much of that territory had belonged to the Byzantine and Persian empires. Now a new power dominated the southern Mediterranean. For many communities north of the Pyrenees, these developments initially seemed distant. Mountain ranges separated Iberia from Gaul. Local rulers remained focused on regional rivalries, succession disputes, and struggles for power much closer to home. That separation gradually became less meaningful. Military expeditions began crossing the mountains. Some sought wealth, some pursued political objectives, others aimed to punish hostile rulers or strengthen influence in contested regions. Each campaign pushed the frontier slightly farther north. At the same time, Gaul itself remained politically divided. The Merovingian kings still occupied the throne, but real authority increasingly belonged elsewhere. Military power had become concentrated in the hands of ambitious nobles who commanded armies rather than ceremonies. Among them, one figure stood above the rest: Charles Martel. He was not king. He did not wear a crown. Yet by the early 730s, he was effectively the strongest political and military leader in the Frankish world. His reputation had not been built through diplomacy. It had been built through victory. Over years of campaigning, Charles defeated rivals, consolidated territory, and expanded his influence across much of Gaul. Nobles who challenged him often found themselves facing disciplined armies and an opponent who rarely rushed into unnecessary risks. Patience became one of his defining characteristics. Farther south, however, another ruler controlled a large and wealthy territory: Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Unlike Charles, Odo's primary concern was preserving independence. Aquitaine occupied an awkward position. It stood between the expanding power of the Franks and the growing influence of Muslim-controlled Iberia. For years, Odo attempted to balance those pressures. Sometimes he cooperated with Frankish leaders, sometimes he resisted them. Like many frontier rulers throughout history, he hoped to preserve room for maneuver between larger powers. That strategy worked until events moved beyond his control. In 732, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi launched a major campaign north of the Pyrenees. Abd al-Rahman was an experienced governor and military commander. He inherited responsibility for one of the most important frontier regions of the Umayyad world. Success brought prestige. Failure invited criticism. Military achievement remained one of the clearest paths to authority. The campaign he organized was substantial. Exactly how large it was remains uncertain. Medieval sources routinely exaggerated numbers, and historians continue debating the size of both armies. What is clear is that the force advancing into Aquitaine represented a serious threat. Odo moved to stop it. The result was catastrophic. Near Bordeaux, Aquitanian resistance collapsed. The defeat opened the countryside to further advance. Settlements were abandoned. Refugees fled northward, carrying stories of destruction and defeat. Whatever confidence Odo possessed before the campaign rapidly disappeared. The loss created a problem that neither ruler could ignore. Odo could no longer defend Aquitaine alone. Charles Martel could no longer assume the threat would remain confined to the south. The interests of two rivals suddenly aligned. Odo appealed for help. Charles accepted. The decision carried immediate military significance, but it also had political consequences. Every setback suffered by Aquitaine increased Charles's influence. Every successful intervention strengthened his authority. For Charles, defeating the invaders meant more than protecting territory. Victory could reshape the balance of power throughout Gaul. Once he committed to the campaign, his attention focused on a single question: where should the battle take place? That question mattered because the two armies fought in very different ways. The force advancing from Iberia possessed considerable mobility. Cavalry played a central role in its operations. Speed had helped carry the campaign deep into Aquitaine. Movement created opportunities. Rapid attacks disrupted opponents before they could recover. Charles had no intention of competing on those terms. Instead, he searched for terrain that reduced those advantages. The region between Tours and Poitiers offered exactly that opportunity. Wooded areas interrupted movement. Rolling ground limited visibility. The autumn weather brought colder conditions than those experienced farther south. Most importantly, the landscape restricted the freedom of large cavalry formations. Charles understood what this meant. If he selected his position carefully, he could force the enemy to attack under less favorable conditions. That choice became the most important decision of the campaign. His army was built around infantry. Many carried spears and shields. Wealthier warriors possessed better armor and weapons. None of those advantages would matter if the formation broke apart. Everything depended on discipline. The soldiers marching under Charles did not need to destroy their opponents with dramatic charges. They needed to stand their ground. Across the countryside, Abd al-Rahman faced a different challenge. His army had won repeatedly during the campaign. Success created confidence. Success also created expectations. An army accustomed to advancing can find prolonged delay surprisingly uncomfortable. Every day spent standing still consumes supplies. Every day spent waiting reduces momentum. Every day without decisive action increases uncertainty. When the two forces finally came within sight of one another, neither commander rushed forward. Days passed. Scouts moved across the landscape. Officers studied enemy positions. Small encounters likely occurred beyond the view of most soldiers. Still, no major battle began. For Charles, the delay was useful. For Abd al-Rahman, the delay gradually became a problem. The governor had advanced hundreds of miles from his base in Iberia. The farther an army traveled, the harder logistics became. Food, information, communication, and control all became more difficult. Charles knew this. That knowledge helped shape his strategy. The longer the standoff continued, the more pressure shifted toward his opponent. Eventually, however, waiting could not continue forever. Two armies stood facing each other. One needed to preserve its position, the other needed to regain momentum. Soon, the first serious attacks would begin. The first serious fighting began after days of tension had already worn down both armies. By the time weapons finally clashed, neither commander was stepping into the unknown. Scouts had observed positions, officers had studied the terrain. Each side had spent enough time watching the other to understand the basic challenge ahead. What remained uncertain was whether those observations were correct. Battles often begin with assumptions. Many are decided when those assumptions prove wrong. For Abd al-Rahman, the central assumption was simple. The Frankish army could be broken. Every successful campaign reinforces confidence in methods that have worked before. His forces had crossed the Pyrenees, defeated Odo, and advanced deep into Aquitaine. The momentum of victory suggested that another opponent could be overcome. Charles Martel expected exactly that conclusion. He wanted the enemy commander to believe an attack would eventually succeed. The Frankish position had been selected for a reason. The soldiers standing in its ranks had been prepared for a reason. Everything depended upon absorbing pressure long enough to force new decisions. As the morning fighting intensified, mounted attacks probed the Frankish line. The details remain frustratingly unclear. Contemporary sources provide only brief descriptions, and later writers often mixed fact with legend. Historians cannot reconstruct every movement across the battlefield. The broader pattern, however, is easier to see. The Frankish formation held. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. Spears projected forward. Shields remained locked together. Attackers searching for weak points found resistance instead. That outcome created an immediate problem for Abd al-Rahman. The initial assaults had failed to produce a breakthrough. A failed attack never ends with a single consequence. It creates a new decision. If one effort does not succeed, should pressure increase? Should tactics change? Should commanders wait for a better opportunity? Throughout the late morning, the answer appears to have been continued pressure. The attacks continued. The Franks continued holding their ground. For Charles, this phase of the battle may have been the most dangerous. His strategy depended entirely on discipline. A defensive formation can survive heavy pressure if everyone remains where they belong. Once units begin moving independently, gaps appear. Gaps create opportunities. Opportunities become disasters. The temptation to abandon formation must have been enormous. Individual warriors could see enemies pulling back after attacks. They could see moments of weakness. They could imagine glory waiting only a short distance beyond the line. Charles needed them to ignore all of it. He needed patience to overcome instinct. Hour after hour, that discipline held. Near midday, the battle entered a more difficult stage. The fighting had lasted long enough for exhaustion to become a factor. Muscles weakened, concentration slipped, wounded men left the line, fresh troops replaced them where possible. Every commander now faced the same question. How much longer could his army maintain its current effort? For Abd al-Rahman, time was becoming increasingly valuable. The campaign had been built upon movement. Remaining locked in a prolonged battle reduced many of the advantages that had brought success earlier. Every additional hour created more uncertainty. For Charles, success remained incomplete. The enemy had not broken. The threat remained directly in front of him. A single collapse in the Frankish line could still reverse the entire situation. Neither commander had achieved what he wanted. Both needed something to change. As the afternoon progressed, events began moving toward a critical point. Some historical accounts describe growing confusion connected to the Umayyad camp and the wealth accumulated during the campaign. Other historians caution that these stories may have been simplified by later chroniclers. The exact sequence remains debated. What matters is that pressure against the Frankish position appears to have become less coordinated than before. Campaigns often produce hidden vulnerabilities. An army advancing successfully gathers supplies, equipment, animals, and valuable goods. Those resources represent rewards for soldiers and evidence of victory. They can also become distractions when attention shifts away from the battlefield itself. Whether concern for the camp triggered the problem or whether simple battlefield confusion played a larger role, cohesion began to weaken. For the first time all day, the attackers faced uncertainty that could not be solved through another charge alone. The responsibility for restoring momentum fell directly upon Abd al-Rahman. Great commanders are often remembered for dramatic victories. Their most difficult moments usually arrive when plans begin falling apart. At such times, leadership becomes intensely personal. Subordinates seek direction, rumors spread, confidence becomes fragile. Abd al-Rahman chose to take a more active role in the fighting. The decision was understandable. If confusion was spreading, visible leadership might restore order. If momentum was fading, personal intervention might revive it. Throughout history, commanders have accepted enormous risks because they believed their presence could influence events. Many succeeded. Others paid for that choice with their lives. Sometime during the afternoon, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi was killed. No source provides a detailed account that historians can accept without reservation. The precise circumstances remain uncertain. We do not know exactly where he fell. We do not know who struck the fatal blow. Yet the importance of his death is beyond dispute. The campaign had been organized under his authority. The army had advanced under his leadership. His loss immediately created a new problem. Who now controlled the battle? Command structures rarely collapse instantly. Experienced officers remained alive. Units continued fighting. Orders continued moving through portions of the army. But battlefield momentum depends heavily on confidence. The death of a commander can spread doubt more rapidly than any physical attack. As news circulated, the offensive energy that had driven the campaign northward began to fade. Charles Martel recognized the changing situation. At that moment, he faced an important decision of his own. Many commanders would have launched an aggressive pursuit. Many would have attempted to turn uncertainty into complete destruction. Charles remained cautious. The same patience that had guided him before the battle continued guiding him during it. He resisted unnecessary risks. He avoided actions that might expose his own army to sudden reversal. The result was less dramatic than a sweeping counterattack. It was also safer. As evening approached, the fighting gradually subsided. Neither side possessed complete information. The Franks knew they had survived. They did not know whether another major attack would arrive the following morning. The surviving Umayyad commanders faced a different reality. Their leader was dead. The campaign's momentum had disappeared. Continuing the struggle offered little promise of success. During the night, they made their decision. The army withdrew. The retreat was not a chaotic rout. Much of the force escaped successfully. Yet the strategic meaning remained clear. The advance had ended. When dawn arrived, Frankish soldiers approached cautiously. Experienced veterans understand that apparent victory can conceal danger. An abandoned position might be a trap. Silence might hide an ambush. Charles advanced carefully. Only after proper observation did the reality become clear. The opposing camp stood empty. The battlefield belonged to the Franks. For the men who survived, the scene must have felt strangely quiet. Hours earlier, the countryside had been filled with violence. Now only evidence remained. Broken equipment lay scattered across the ground. Wounded men awaited treatment. Bodies marked the places where fighting had been most intense. The campaign that had carried an army across mountains and deep into Gaul had reached its conclusion. Determining casualties remains impossible. Medieval chroniclers frequently exaggerated losses, sometimes by extraordinary margins. Modern historians generally avoid accepting such figures at face value. What can be stated with confidence is that both sides suffered casualties and that the death of Abd al-Rahman represented the most important loss of the entire campaign. The political consequences appeared almost immediately. Charles Martel emerged from the battle stronger than he had entered it. Military success increased prestige. Prestige increased authority. Authority made future success easier to achieve. Throughout Gaul, rulers and nobles paid attention to results. A commander capable of stopping a major invasion naturally gained influence. Odo experienced the opposite side of that reality. Although he survived, his dependence on Frankish assistance had become impossible to ignore. Aquitaine remained important, but its ability to operate independently was diminished. The battle had altered relationships as well as borders. Over the longer term, the consequences became even more significant. Tours did not instantly transform Europe. History rarely works that way. No single battle determines the future of an entire continent. Yet some victories create conditions that influence generations. This was one of them. The prestige Charles gained contributed to the continuing rise of Carolingian power. His family would eventually replace the Merovingian dynasty. His grandson, Charlemagne, would build an empire stretching across much of Western Europe. Tours was not the sole reason for that development. It was, however, an important step along the road. That connection helps explain why the battle became so famous. For centuries, writers described it as the moment Europe was saved from conquest. Such interpretations reflected the concerns and beliefs of later generations as much as the realities of 732. Modern historians tend to be more cautious. The goals of al-Rahman's campaign remain debated. The long-term possibilities remain uncertain. No one can say with confidence exactly what might have happened if events had unfolded differently. What historians can say is that the battle mattered. It halted a major advance into Gaul. It strengthened the most powerful Frankish leader of the age. It contributed to the rise of a dynasty that would shape medieval Europe. The military lessons remain surprisingly familiar. Commanders must understand terrain before seeking battle. Discipline can defeat superior mobility when conditions are favorable. Logistics quietly influence campaigns long before armies meet. Patience often achieves what aggression cannot. Most importantly, strategic success frequently begins with forcing an opponent into difficult choices. Charles Martel spent much of the campaign doing exactly that. He chose the ground. He chose when to stand. He refused to fight on unfavorable terms. Everything that followed grew from those decisions. Centuries later, historians still debate details of the battle. The exact location remains uncertain. Casualty figures remain disputed. Legends continue mixing with fact. Yet the memory of that cold October confrontation endures because its consequences reached far beyond the men who fought it. On a field between Tours and Poitiers, one army held its ground, another abandoned its campaign, and the political future of Western Europe moved in a new direction.